Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Janelle Blue, president of the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society and the sponsor of this program. And I'll be your host today. And we have a very special guest today, Paul Phelps. Paul is a professional writer, retired, and also heads up our special interest group for writing at the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society. In our last segment, we talked generally about writing and how hard it is to get started. And in this segment, we want to talk to Paul about digging into a little bit more about getting a story together, how to get it started, what to do, what to think about to be able to get that story started. So welcome, Paul. We're happy that you're here today and look forward to hearing all about how to get some writing done in our genealogical journey.
All right.
So start us off. What's some general rules to think about when we have all these pieces of research and we are ready to tell the story of our ancestor? How should we think about this?
If you have the materials, the best way to start writing is just to start writing. You can always revise later. And if you start with one thing, you can always add another thing to it. It's good to ask yourself a few questions in advance, most important being, who am I writing for? The question of how should I write, the purpose of my writing, pretty much follows from who am I writing for. If you're writing for posterity, if you mean to write an encyclopedic history of your family with each and every ancestor and each and every descendant, you've got a big job in front of you.
Yes.
And you need to organize it formally in some way.
What does that mean?
Well, a numbering system.
Right.
For example.
Right, a genealogical.
Most people have seen that in formal genealogies. It's because when you've got 16 generations and every other one is named William, you need a way to tell them apart.
Right, right.
It's simply a way of helping your reader to keep what you're giving him straight.
Right.
Most readers are in trouble most of the time, so anything you can do to help them is going to be useful.
I sometimes use a timeline too, not as part of the story, but just to help me keep on track and remind me of some of the events, the external events that are going on.
I use a timeline to organize my notes so that when I go to look at what I know about a person, it's organized in chronological order. It makes it much easier for me to keep track of the information. But most people aren't writing encyclopedic histories.
Right, right.
They might be writing an article for a genealogical journal. That's pretty ambitious, especially for a beginning writer. There's rules of evidence and rules of writing and rules of formatting, and you wind up with a page that has half a page of text and half a page of footnotes. And that's not really friendly writing for most readers. Some people will want that, and when that's what's required, that's what you do. But if you're just telling a story for your brothers and sisters or for your kids or your grandchildren, you want to make it an entertaining story, an anecdote. Something that happened in family history. And I told a story last time about the ancestor who got killed in a tornado, and all of his kids were sucked out of they lived in a sod house in Nebraska. And that was one incident. It turned out that guy was sort of a sad sack who had had one disaster after another as he moved west. And it was because the family farm had been subdivided too many times between too many sons. There wasn't any land left for him, so he had to go to New York, and then he went to Michigan, and then he went to Wisconsin, and each time he failed. So that became a theme in telling his story.
Okay.
It was a recurring event or a leitmotif that helped to keep the story together. Unfortunate for him, but lucky for me as the writer, because it gave me a way to organize the story.
Wow. So, yeah, I mean, I have a story similar to that where the guy was just a ne'er-do-well. He just always, you know, couldn't be depended on, left his family, and just sort of backing up to how to get started. You know, that first paragraph is the hardest one to do. And I've heard writers say, skip the first paragraph and do it later.
You can always come back.
You can, but because by the time you write the rest of the story, sometimes that first paragraph will come together a lot easier. So
well, in this case, you know, you write one story about him and then you find out something else about him and something else about him, and the first paragraph comes to you. L. Nathan never had any luck. Or I think I wrote a piece about him called Born Under a Dark Cloud, because as it happens, he was born the year that Krakatoa blew in Indonesia and threw so much dust into the air that New England had what they called the year without a summer. It snowed every month in 1816, 1817, and they got no crops at all. How they managed not to starve, I'm not sure.
So you found that out by researching the newspapers?
No, this was, well, I read history. What else happened that year?
Yeah.
Didn't happen to him, but it happened to everybody else in New England, so chances are he experienced it too.
And that really adds a lot of flavor to the story, doesn't it?
So he was born under this cloud, and then he had a series of disasters that wound up finally with him hanging from a tree in Nebraska after a tornado.
So I guess the first question then is, why are you writing? I mean, what's the purpose? Are you writing it to hand down to your kids? Are you going to put it in a library? Are you going to put it in a journal? Do you want to have it as a basis for other research in the future? So that's an important question to answer, right?
Yes, yes it is. I don't write to discover. That's one of the techniques that a nonfiction writer will use. You write a piece to discover what you believe.
So not to interrupt you, but you were a science writer, right? I mean, you wrote about.
Was.
So how is that different from writing like a genealogy story?
Well, genealogy story focuses on a person and the events of that person's life. And when you're writing about science or science policy or technology, you're writing about something, a piece about commuter aircraft.
Informational.
It's informational, and it's designed to convey the facts about it and the policy questions that arise from that industry. This industry is important because we need smaller aircraft to connect to big hub airports. Who produces those aircraft? Is that an industry that the United States should protect at home or encourage overseas? It turns out that some of the very best commuter aircraft are made in Northern Ireland, Spain, Indonesia, Australia. So it isn't something that doesn't exist. It's something that the United States should take advantage of rather than trying to create anew.
Okay, so genealogy then is really more about painting a picture of something.
Of a person.
Of a person.
A person and a family.
Yeah.
And
putting.
Most people care about their own family.
Right.
It's harder when you're writing about somebody else's family because it's hard to get people interested in somebody else's family.
Right, right.
So that's one of the reasons why you want to try and keep it as interesting as you can.
And you want to start with your own family.
Well, that's where most people start.
Yeah, because that's why they're interested.
I was lucky. My family is very well documented. There was an encyclopedic book about my family written in 1899.
Ooh, you are lucky.
No, a few things were wrong, and there's a whole lot of holes in it since 1899. But you know, the research is pretty much done. So I had to do my mother's family, and then I did my wife's family, and then I did my neighbor's family, and now I research for people, you know, strangers on the internet, because I can help them.
Yeah.
People helped me when I was starting out, and genealogy should be a collaboration. You research in Texas. There are people in Texas who know what you're looking for.
Yes.
You just have to find them.
That's right. That's right. And this is, I'm just going to take a pause here a little bit and talk about the SIG, because it just segues right into what you were saying. So you run a special interest group for the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society.
On writing family history.
Writing family history. And here you're dealing with people who are maybe have never started writing before, and you help them get started.
Never thought they could. I don't know how they got into doing the research on family history if they never intended to do anything with it. And lots of times it's a spouse who says, you've been in your study for the last 6 months doing research on the internet about such and such. When are you going to tell me about it?
But don't you know how much fun it is to go online to Ancestry and find this aha moment?
The thrill of genealogy is the thrill of doing puzzles.
Yes.
Or discovering things, solving a puzzle. And telling the story is a whole nother experience.
Right.
You have to make the thrill that you get from learning about it, you have to convey to someone else. And that's not always as easy.
I know, it isn't.
And footnotes, I think, don't make it any easier. But that's just me. I understand the genealogical standard of proof. I applaud it. I try to live by it. I don't use it so much in my writing because I find that it gets in the way. It gets in the way of a good story. But it is a good thing to make sure that the story's mostly true.
Well, and I guess if you aren't going to follow the genealogical proof standard of documentation, then you probably should make that clear in that story that this is with
this
qualifiers.
This is a story that Uncle Paul told.
Yeah, and it probably, or it could have happened, or, you know, some qualifiers within the story a little bit.
I try not to lapse into creative nonfiction.
I was going to ask you about that term.
Well, it's like Tom Wolfe's New Journalism. This might be what happened.
Yeah.
But it's, you know, enhanced.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't really know the facts, you need to flesh it out somehow. You can learn things from the newspapers in that area. Mm-hmm. You can learn things by using the FAN method, families, associates, and neighbors. Mm-hmm. You don't know where they were, but you know that the people on either side of them lived on either side of them when they were back in Brooklyn.
Right.
So maybe they moved together.
Quite possibly.
If he went to work for a certain company,
right?
Was that because his daughter married the son of the guy who ran that company?
Can you pose that question in the what you're writing?
As long as you pose it as a question,
yes,
and not something you know for sure,
yeah,
or something that you're guessing about,
yeah.
You know, there's lots of ways to coach a speculation. So you know. It might have been, it could have been, he may have found, they probably experienced the pandemic. If they went through a pandemic and it affected everybody in the country, well, they experienced it. You don't know what their particular experience was, but everybody had to wear masks.
Right.
Everybody had to get vaccinated. This is something that was the common experience to everyone. You can assume safely that they experienced it too, unless they belong to some strange cult.
So the difference between transcribing a oral history and writing what you're talking about is the difference. It's what Aunt Velma said as the gospel truth.
I didn't say it was gospel. I just said that Aunt Velma said it.
But I mean, if you were doing oral history,
Yes.
then Aunt Velma is pretty sure that this is what happened because she remembers from 75 years ago what happened, and you write it down.
Yeah, yeah.
So-
and we're having a special project at Mount Vernon called Pandemic Stories.
Right.
Then and now. If you've got a relative whose father told them about the pandemic in 1918, we'd like to have you write that down.
Yep.
But more than that, we'd like to have you write pieces about what your experience of the pandemic is in 2020 and 2021.
Right.
What are you going through? That way there's going to be raw material for genealogists 100 years from now.
That's right.
To know what the experience was like.
And what's even more important is that if that person that many years forward is doing research on their family, they might be able to pick up that book that the society is publishing in a local library and actually see what happened to their family.
Right.
And because it's present time, it's getting pretty close to the actual thing that happened. You don't have to question everything in that story because
the closer the source is to the actual event, the more reliable it is generally.
Yes, of course. We know from many examples that people...
Our colleague Chuck Mason, who has a grandmother who always lied about everything, and as he's fond of saying.
So one of the things I struggle with is, so once I find the focus, once I decide what my theme is, keeping that in line, keeping that focus throughout, and sort of starting out with a premise and wrapping it up, and being able to keep that thread going throughout the story. And how do you do that?
If you have a premise, you're ahead of the game, because that's the direction you're going to go. I think that such and such was the story of his life, and I'm going to marshal the facts to prove that that was the case. Lots of times you come back and write that premise later, after you've laid out the facts and you figure out what it is they're showing you. Sometimes that's an organizing principle for what you write. If your family migrated a lot, they migrated from Russia to Germany, and from Germany to Texas, and from Texas to
Louisiana,
Oregon, then that migration is a way of organizing your story generation by generation. If you don't have that, perhaps they started out as landless peasants in Spain, but they came to the United States and were able to get a land grant. And the sons got an even bigger land grant. And now they're successful farmers out in Kansas, named Valenzuela. And they said, well, that's a very common name in Kansas. But that, again, is an organizing principle. It shows the social mobility of that family as they come to the United States. Maybe...
So that's sort of the theme, is that
a
they were...
A theme, a leitmotif.
That they were traveling...
That holds it together. They were a traveling family, or they were an upwardly mobile family. In some black families, especially from the Caribbean, there was a custom that the son should always marry a woman who was lighter colored than he was, because that's how you became upper class.
I see.
Didn't work.
Yeah.
But this is a story that organizes a lot of family histories written by Caribbean authors.
Really?
About how the sons tried to become white.
Wow. And I wrote this article about this guy sort of from his birth to death. And one of the things that caught my eye was his military record said that he had indifferent character. And I thought that was such an interesting term. I actually went into the military, some of the handbooks to try to figure out what their definition of indifferent character, I mean, I knew what it meant to me, but the military sometimes has other ideas about definitions.
They have their own euphemisms, yes.
But I used that as the theme throughout his life to point out, you know, that he abandoned his family. His father had abandoned him. He married 6 times, all these things to try to point out that he was indifferent about his life, about the relationships that he had.
Or he was a straight up scoundrel.
Well, I didn't say that, but I wanted to.
Lots of times you want that scoundrel. I'd much rather have a moonshiner to write about than a preacher.
Well, I was
Because a
afraid.
preacher's never going to do anything interesting.
But I was afraid of being too judgmental.
Why?
Well, I don't know, because he didn't deserve.
No guilt devolves to you from the behavior of your ancestors. If your ancestors owned slaves, well, that's on them.
Yeah.
It's not on you.
Yeah. Wow. But I was trying to be really factual and not add too much judgment to it. And yet, had I done that, it would have been a much more interesting story
Would
if
have
I
given
had
you
said,
a good topic sentence.
you know, my husband's grandfather was a scoundrel. I mean, everybody would have wanted to read that. But honestly, I don't think people knew in my title what indifferent character. I don't think that brought their eye to anything. I doubt that half of the people even read the thing, even though it was published, because what does that mean?
If you're a writer and you want people to read you,
Yeah.
that's giving them a reason to read you.
Yeah, because they don't know what it means. Now, the other thing that's really
Let's face it, he was a scoundrel. Good title.
Yeah, yeah. Now people would have really wanted to read that one.
There you are.
Well,
And
I guess.
as long as the story lives up to the title,
Yeah.
you're perfectly within reason.
If I wanted to embellish in some of the story, but I was trying to keep it as factual as possible, so it might have not been quite as colorful as it could have been if I had maybe added some things to it. But the other thing is title. People get hung up on what's the title of this going to be before you ever even write the
that's
thing.
the last thing you choose. In fact, sometimes you're better off letting the editor choose that. I'm notoriously bad at titles.
Really?
I don't always come up with a title that's going to grab the reader's attention.
So if you're writing a story, do you sort of do it chronologically, or
Sure.
do you jump around? Do you find that, being able to...
A story has a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yeah.
That might be birth, marriage, and death.
Uh-huh.
And everything else falls in a chronological sequence.
But you could start with the main story first and then back up and say, John was... This could have happened because John was born then, and...
My natural writing form is 1 page, 500 words.
Wow.
Maybe 1,000 words. And that means that to do a family history, I'm stringing together a bunch of stories. That's an easier way to write it anyhow. You write a story about Aunt Velma and what she said. And then you write a story about the moonshiner, and you write a story about the preacher. And you put them together in a book of ancestors.
Okay.
That's a great gift to give to grandchildren.
Yeah.
Who might otherwise not know them, and it will make them more interesting than they would have been otherwise. You want to give them a family tree so they know how these people relate to them.
Right, right. And it's always good to, from a genealogical standpoint, to start with that tree. Build that tree on Family Tree Maker or Roots Magic or something, so that you've got all of that documented.
Family Tree Maker turns out to be a very good way of keeping your research organized, because the notes that you have on each person are attached to that person. And if you've been careful, as you're filling in your notes, the things that you find in your research, you put them in there in chronological order, so that each person's little more about note is a timeline of their life.
Yep. So For our viewers, I guess some of the points that you've made is, number one, get it in writing. Just start writing,
Yes.
and you can edit it later. Other people can help you edit.
That's what the SIG is for.
Join the
We have
SIG.
published writers, we have raw beginners, and everything in between. I used to teach English, so I'm a good editor, teacher, but we have others who are just as good as I am. We can help you figure out what's good in your story, what's not so good in your story, what's missing from your story. Lots of time, the hard thing for a writer to realize is what he hasn't talked about. Or you mention something that's interesting and your reader wants to hear more about that. Can you tell me more about, give me another paragraph about that, because that's interesting.
Yes.
And it's getting that sense of who the reader is, what the reader needs or wants to know. And it's hard for you as a writer to know that unless you're getting feedback from readers.
Right.
That's what we're there as your first reader.
Paul, we're running out of time. I thank you so much for being here today, and hopefully we've inspired our viewers to pick up that pencil or pen or their computer and just start writing.
Or come join the SIG and join us on a Zoom meeting.
And please look into Mount Vernon Genealogical Society. We're doing our meetings on Zoom these days, but someday we're going to be back at the Holland Hall Center, which is at 1500 Shenandoah, not Pennsylvania. And we love to have you join us. Go to our website, mvgenealogy.org, and you will see our events and also information about Paul's SIG. You're all welcome.
And about the writing contest.
And we have a writing contest
writing
too.
Project.
Yep. And so you're all welcome. And thank you again, Paul. This has been very interesting. And happy writing.